All right, let's get into this. We're looking at 400 years of the church today, and we're going to do more of an overview. And the reason is because there's a lot that went on, but not a lot of it actually pertains in the same way, just in a directly relevant way to where we are now. But so we're looking at a 400-year period, and it's an important 400-year period because it began the first major shift in the church that gives us, and it'll end, as we look at today, with one of the major shifts of the church that shaped the entire way the world sees Christianity. And in my mind, I'm a very visual person, so I imagine that from the time of Christ, there's this line, and it's called the Orthodox line, and it goes from the time of Christ up to the present day. But at some point, there was a break. And so you imagine a line going across this way, and at some point it peels off and breaks. Now, this wasn't a stark break that just shot up and went this way. It was a gradual break that happened over several hundred years of the church, and that is what we're looking at. And what it is the break between the East, that we now call the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Church, and that includes Antiochian, Ethiopian, Greek, Russian, all of the Orthodox churches that take part in that tradition are a part of that whole east side. And then there's the Western Church or the Roman Church. And some of you say, oh, the Roman Catholic Church. Well, it actually wasn't considered the Roman Catholic Church at this point. The Roman Catholic Church is something that developed over the next 500 years and sort of established its identity even more firmly in the Reformation as they distinguished themselves from the protesting Protestants. But at this point, it was the East and the West, and really at the beginning, and we've looked at these councils. We've looked at 5 councils already over the last 600 years of the church, and every single one of those councils had representation from the East and the West together, and they met and they made decisions. But over what happened over this 400-year period actually separated them, and you'll find, and I think you'll realize as we look at it, it has less to do with theology and more to do with human sin. And so just keep that in the back of your mind as we look at it. One correction on your timelines, if you have a pen, you can change it. Good old spell check. In my lack of attention to detail, once I typed it in, it should not say the Synod of Whitney, as in Whitney Houston. That was an autocorrect. It should say the Synod of Whitby, which apparently is not in Apple's dictionary. But let's start a little back, and you might ask, why on earth did Jason put something about Islam in there? But I did that in particular because we're looking at world religions, and it's interesting to see where world religions started. And prior to 610, there was no Islam. So it's an old religion, but prior to 610, there was no presence of Islam. There were tribal groups, there were tribal connections. Islam traces its genetic lineage back to Ishmael and the story of Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael, and God said, I will make a great nation. After they booted Hagar and Ishmael out, God said, I'll make a great nation of them. You don't have to worry about it, Abraham. And through the genetic line and passing down in the same way the Davidic line did for Jesus, in 610, a prophet by the name of Muhammad came on the scene, and he had a revelation, and his revelation came in 3 parts. One, he felt the call that this divine God was calling him to submission to God, to a further detail or expression of the last judgment, what would happen. And this isn't a new category. There were many traditions around the history of the church who actually had, or around the history of the church and in prior to that had this end times last judgment. As those of you who are in the world religions class, Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religions in the world, have this category in their cosmology, this last judgment. But the third, interestingly enough, is care for the poor. So when we think about Muhammad, we often think, oh, that's a false religion. But what he experienced in this relationship, or this revelation with God, was a call to submission, a reminder that he would be judged, or those within this earth would be judged, and a call to care for the poor. And that's not far from what Israel actually was called to by God, Yahweh. Now, the other thing I just wanted to point out as we move on, and this is something I've been sort of tooling with as we looked at the world of religions, or religions of the world, is that if Islam worshipped, or the Ishmael line, or the Ishmaelites worshipped a God of the God of Israel. It was the same connection. It was God that was guiding and directing them. And through those hundreds of years, of those centuries, until the time that Muhammad came to have that prophecy, there is some sense of the Muslims are worshiping, in their mindset, and maybe it should be in ours, the same God that we are. Now, does that mean they're worshiping the same God right? No. Does that mean that they acknowledge Christ as Lord and Savior and the fullest incarnation of the world? No. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the worship that they offer 5 times a day as they faced toward Mecca isn't towards the same God that we worship. I'm not trying to say that they're the same in us in any way, because they look at Jesus as a prophet, and that's the thing that makes us Christians, is that Jesus is the fullest revelation of who God is. But next time you encounter a Muslim, consider for the fact that they actually in some way are worshiping, or in an actual way are worshiping the same God that we call Yahweh, but they call Allah, which is their general term for God. Muhammad died in 622, but this started the Nation of Islam, and it carried through, and Islam began to spread. And as much very similar to the time and the place that this was unearthing, that many things were taken over by force. In Islam, and I'm not going to go into the history of Islam, but as they expanded east and moved through the sort of the Persian region into India and south and around in the Middle East, and actually ultimately into northern Africa, you have this expansion. And over the next 400 years, this period we're looking at, Christianity, after the fall of Rome, was losing its strength, or its stronghold, and Muslims became sort of the prominent expression of faith during this time through Europe. This was a wonky time where they were trying to figure it out. Most of Western Christianity came through monastic communities that were kind of small and localized, and it was during certain periods, and I'll point those out during the next 400 years, that Christianity started to be rebirthed and started to take hold again. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I want you to make note of is last week we said that Gregor the Great, at the end of the 6th century, it reinstituted Benedictine spirituality as the primary way of expressing spirituality in Western Europe. Now, what's interesting about this is, how many of you have heard of Gregorian chants? You notice no music, very liturgical, feels very high church. Well, this was who it was named after. Gregory the Great, and it had a style of music. As he instituted liturgical worship without instruments in the church, they needed a way to carry the hymns of our faith. And so they developed this concept of Gregorian chants. And as they chanted these things, this, both in alignment with monasticism, became the primary way for several centuries of the church that Christians worshiped and expressed their sung praises to God. Not only did Islam tend to spread and weaken Christianity, there were others who were deciding, how do we associate with the church as a whole? And the Synod of Whitby, not Whitney, came about in 663, and this was basically a synod that was held in the island that we now know as the UK. And they were making a decision of should they follow Celtic spirituality coming out of Ireland, or should they align themselves with Rome? And through much debate and time, they decided that they would actually align themselves in Rome because there was apostolic succession there. Peter and Paul were there, they ministered there, they were imprisoned there, and they felt like that was closer to the apostolic passing down of the faith. But what's unique about this and important about this event is that decision aligned the island of Britain with the Roman Church for the next 9 centuries, until King Henry started to do the flip-flop back and forth because he wanted to get divorced and married and divorced and married and do his own thing. And then eventually he just said, forget it, we're going to develop our own thing. How many of you are Episcopalians? Yeah? In the theological world, we like to say that you ride the fence. You never really know which side of it you fit on. So, you know, you can straddle these, not the fence, these are electrified over here, so don't touch them, but you'll get a shock. But it's important to think about the fact that one decision, one synod, aligned an entire nation with an expression of Christianity for over 900 years. That's a pretty significant decision, and if you're an Episcopalian in particular, or even those who are Presbyterian or Methodist, all of those Protestant denominations that really came to what we call now the United States of America, as they came over to this land, they brought that expression, both that was informed by Roman Catholicism for 900 years, but also the Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to in a few weeks. By 1980, tensions of the Eastern and Western churches had grown, and in particular, they had grown. Did I say something wrong? Oh, jeez, I did it. 680. I don't know. Seriously, there's something wrong with my brain. In 680, the tension, so they grew, and it was around celibacy. And I'm just going to name it. You know, one of the controversial issues around the Roman Catholic Church is issues of pedophilia and things like that. And yes, you're like, why are you bringing this up in church? Because it's a fact of the matter. It's something that the Roman Catholic Church is dealing with. And if you want to trace that challenge, and there are a lot of good reasons, but the Western Church felt like the clergy should not be married. And it should be, in sort of St. Paul's words, that marriage was for those who felt they were weak. And celibacy was what they were called to. And the Western Church really wanted to emphasize this sense of dedicating one's life to God. Whereas in the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Church, they said, no, those who are clerics, those who are priests in that role, they could actually be married. And we see the outplay of that even today. And you wonder what would happen back then if they went. And the challenge behind this is about the time where we started seeing tensions between the East and the West. We think this, you think that, we're not feeling that sense of unity. They had already divided over language, and Constantinople was the primary center of the East, and Rome was the primary center, because it's reversed, and center of the West. And so, as you'll see in the next few minutes, that sort of tension grew and grew and culminated in the Great Schism of 1056. By 690, in the 690s, you had the completion of what we now know as the Dome of the Rock. It was built on the Temple Mount, not by Christians, but by Muslims. And this is the challenge that we understand ourselves. That was meant to be a testimony of the Muslim presence in Jerusalem, and they took the sacred space of Christianity. And something that maybe that we and those of us who were in the world religions class have looked at is we often, Christianity, as you know, is sort of an extension of Judaism. And we feel like we are the correction of what Judaism got wrong or mistakenly understood, but we're the fullest expression of what God did through Judaism. Well, Muslims feel that they are the extension of what we got wrong as Christians. Now, we don't accept that because they view Christ as a prophet and not as God incarnate, and that's where primary difference of where we separate ourselves from Muslims. But keep in mind that as they took over, they saw that as a holy thing. They felt like they were doing God's work. And we too have participated in those overtaking. We have times in history where we by force took over parts of Europe or parts of the world under the name of Christ, and they did too, and that's what brought this Dome of the Rock into its existence. By the 700s, Western monasticism was fully established, and there's a little town called Cluny in France where they established a monastery, and this was considered the sort of birthplace of the full expression of Western monasticism. For those of you who know, we sing Taizé chants. Taizé is about 5 kilometers from Cluny, and it's a modern 20th century expression of monasticism, and that came out, but that dates its sort of history back to the 700s. And in fact, you can still go to Cluny today and see the original remnants of the original abbey. By 731, Pope Gregory III, so his grandson at this point, condemned iconoclasm and supported the veneration of icons. And this is another interesting division point. Those in the West, in Rome, wanted to take things like the icons of the saints, and they wanted them in their churches, and they wanted them hung, and they reminded them of the stories of the Bible. And in a pre-literate time, these were key images to help the body as a whole remember stories of the Bible, remember those saints that had gone before them. And if you take into account that the Apocrypha, those intertestamental books that were written between 400 BC and the time of Christ, talk about using intercessors other than Christ to pray, those within the Roman Catholic Church, and to some extent the Orthodox Church, but in particular the Roman Catholic Church, interpreted those as we should be praying to or through those, not that we see that the prayers go through or we revere these symbols or icons as being holy themselves, but as portals to the holy. Now, some of you might say, oh, we shouldn't look at icons, or icons are bad. They're sacred. Even Roman Catholics don't believe there's anything sacred in the icon, don't believe that the icon is going to bring salvation. They believe that the icon is a porthole to elevate our minds, that we ought to revere them. And that's what it means to venerate, to revere something, to hold it as special. And you might say, oh, well, we shouldn't be doing that. Jesus is the only thing that we should revere. Well, they differentiated between the reverence towards something and the adoration of something. And quite frankly, we in all of our lives make things holy. The amount of times throughout the summer that I see folks go back to that columbarium and place their hand on a niche where their dead ones lie, cremated into ashes, they hold that niche as holy and sacred space for themselves. They might even talk to their loved ones. And so and I guess I'm saying all this is because we in many places in our life make things sacred. And rather than condemn or look down upon or reject what the Roman Catholics' view of understanding of icons or sacred things, we should first step back and say, what have we made sacred in our own lives before we cast condemnation on others for using icons or pictures or narratives of the church to increase or to support their own expression of spirituality. Now, the Eastern Church said we can't do this, and there's a whole movement called iconoclasm, and they're called iconoclasts, who wanted to destroy all icons and everything about them. And so there's several century, and this sort of controversy carries on all the way up, even through the Reformation. So know that this is something that continued to follow them. We're moving on. We get to 1054, we get the Byzantine bishops who want to endorse iconoclasm, which means, again, the destruction of the icons. So the Byzantine, the Eastern bishops, the Eastern authorities of the church wanted to get rid of icons, but the Western church did not. And this is another major place where we start to see severe division between the East and the West. And then it sort of really came to a head when Charlemagne in 768, I'm going to do that thoughtfully, through about the beginning of the 800s, Charlemagne advanced Christianity through France, Germany, and Italy, and took hold of it. And since that time, those countries where we see much of our theology, both from the Roman Catholic Church in Italy, but also from the Protestant Reformation in France and in Germany, these were the hearts or the central locations where much of the theology of what we rely on today came into being. It became the hotbed around the world of Western spirituality. This led to the last ecumenical council in 787. It's called the Second Council of Nicaea, where they condemned iconoclasm, the destruction of it, and the Eastern Church sort of softened their perspective a little bit, although it came back up again, and a doctrine called adoptionism, which said that Jesus was adopted, that he was a regular human being, there was no virgin birth, and God adopted this perfect human being and preserved him and basically made him the sacrificial lamb for all of humanity, and something that we do condemn as a heresy. But in that sort of break, this was the last time they met because they felt that there were tensions there, and the Eastern Church didn't leave feeling too great about that. Not even 2 decades later, Charlemagne is crowned the Roman Empire by Pope Leo III and institutes an educational and spiritual reform throughout all of Western Europe. And this is where you start to see Christianity take another foothold or a renewed foothold in Europe. And this is what, for many of you, probably historians in the group, are called the Carolingian Renaissance, where we started to see education become more and more important. And that leads us to the last two things that we need to understand about this period. The first is the Phocian schism, and this was what began the final break between the Eastern and the Western Church. And what happened was, you had to understand it, at this time of the church, there wasn't any one person that was in charge. It was a series of bishops that were scattered around Europe, and the Eastern Church had more of a collective way of understanding. They called them patriarchs, and they were named for regions where they governed. And the Pope in Rome was considered the bishop or the patriarch of the West. Well, the Pope in Rome decided he didn't want to be one among many, but he wanted to be the first among many. He wanted a special place, and so he started to push this agenda to say, no, I want my role, I want my power, I want my authority. And part of this goes back to the papal authority. They believe that that the papal line goes all the way back from Peter and was passed down, and therefore, just as God said, or Jesus said to Peter, you are my rock, these are the keys to the kingdom. That understanding of Peter's role became significant for the Western Church and ultimately empowered the Pope to say, no, I'm actually above all of the Eastern bishops or all of the Eastern patriarchs. This naturally made some of the Eastern folks not happy. You think you're better than me? I don't think so. And tensions started to grow, and they started to sort of send letters back and forth, and it ultimately, and it centered around the idea that the East was using leavened bread and the West was using unleavened bread. And this was a problem because the East thought the West was adhering or trying to make their sacraments a little too close to Jewish idea of unleavened bread, and the East felt like it should be blessed bread that has leavening. And so if you go to take communion in an Eastern Orthodox church, it's not flat and without leavening, it's puffy and looks like a nice French loaf. And they call it blessed bread. But what happened was the Eastern and the Western patriarchs, in particular the one in Constantinople, and I'm doing the wrong way, this way for you, and in Rome, the Pope, the Pope sent basically an edict over, a statement over to the East and said, I'm rejecting your authority as the patriarch in Constantinople to basically assign a lay person, and this was the Phocian. There was a patriarch there who wanted to basically assign a region to this lay person and give him authority, and the Western Pope said, I don't think so. And then it became this power struggle, and ultimately what we say was the massive split in 1056 was over a word called filioque. And oque means and the, and fili as a root in Latin, the son. So, and the son. And the issue came around the idea of, in the Nicene Creed, it says that the Spirit proceeded from the Father. And in the East, they only wanted it to say in the Father. But in the West, they wanted it to say in the Son. So from the Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. And you might say, again, this is splitting hairs, but it's not insofar as when you think about the controversies that the West faced in terms of understanding the makeup of Jesus. Think about all the Theotokos, the Mother of God, and what that meant and what that implied about Jesus's composition. And so for the West, if the Spirit didn't come from Jesus, it dipped too closely to what we call an Arian controversy, that Jesus wasn't fully divine. And it was over, supposedly, this issue of filioque that the Western Church excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then the Patriarch of Constantinople, in turn, excommunicated the Pope in the West. And it's a matter of fact that it wasn't until the last century in this is actually a 19 number, 1965, that the Eastern and the Western churches actually mended that issue that happened over 1,000 years ago. All that is to say, 400 years of history brought a lot of figuring out what it meant to be the church, but it also brought one of the major, biggest, largest divides of the history of our church that we've ever seen. And if you think the Protestant Reformation divided the church, it did in the West, but not in the terms of East and West. So today, if you want to understand how the East worships, go to an Eastern Orthodox church when you're home over the school year or you're visiting, and you'll get a little taste of how the Orthodox actually still continue to worship. And in the same way, if you go to Roman Catholic Church, you see the liturgies and the patterns of worship that developed really from a little earlier than this time, all the way up to the 16th century, where they were solidifying this expression. But today we have three traditions in the church: Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestants. And Protestants, we're just like Baskin Robbins. There's never-ending flavors. But in the East and the West, that division between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church is something significant. And it marked the beginning of a fracture of our church, and the fracture of the united body that experienced unity for the first 1,000 years of the church. It's an interesting period that's filled with a lot more political and social facts than necessary ecclesial ones. And if you're interested, I can recommend a few resources after the surface. But otherwise, the big thing I want you to take away from is the fractures and the dissonance we feel within the church today started around these periods. Now, this is what I love about this community that we have here. We have Roman Catholics, we've had Orthodox, we have lots of different Protestants, and we have found our commonality in our love for Christ and our acknowledgement that Jesus is our Lord and Savior. And that gives us the freedom in this modern day age to worship God in unity and in truth together. We have something special here, folks, so I hope you don't overlook that an ecumenical body of Christians from around the country, maybe even the world, worshiping together and offering praise to a united God. We believe in one God, one faith, and one baptism. And today, as we sing one of the oldest hymns from this period, a Christmas hymn, this is Christmas in July, we're going to sing, O Come, Emmanuel. Let us sing together in unity and in truth. Let's stand together as we sing.